Are you looking to sharpen your budgeting skills? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast, where we talk about life, family, and how to afford it. And now, the Budget Couple themselves, Nate and Danielle.
Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast. I'm Nate.
And I'm Danielle.
And this week, we're going to talk about budget by numbers. Before we get into that, we'd like to ask you if you could please leave us a review on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, whatever you're using. If you could review us, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, we desperately need questions. Please send in your questions. It would help us really make the show even better, and we'd love to be able to help you out. So no question is too small. Please, please, please let us know what you have. We're going to be opening up some things to make that easier in the very near future. But for right now, you can always just go to our website, budgetcouple.com, and go to our contact form and contact us from there. But we'll have a couple other methods here, probably by our next episode.
When you go out there to start your budgeting journey and you probably go onto Google, you start looking up what some of the options are, what you should do, what some of the numbers are when it comes to the best practices for budgeting. You probably see a lot of numbers. There's a lot of percentages. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of, this works best. This doesn't. And so we thought it would be cool to just go through and look at some of those numbers that you might see out there in websites and just Google searches, in articles, and pull them together and kind of compare it against our budget and our numbers. So to get us started, one of the big rules that you see floating around is the 50-30-20 rule, and it actually was developed, in part at least, by Elizabeth Warren.
Now, what's funny about this one is we never really even knew about it when we were designing our budget and how everything works. We had no idea that this existed, but this is apparently a really popular way to budget because it's really simple. You need to know 3 numbers, and as long as your stuff fits in those 3 numbers, you're doing fine. And we're running numbers here with you, but it's a pretty good way to set up a budget.
I have my problems with it, but we can talk about that as we go along here. So we'll start off with just what it is if you haven't heard of it, because I actually hadn't heard of it either. 50% should be spent on your needs, your necessities, and that's things like house, transportation, food, utilities. These are things you need to live, and that is it. 30% should be spent on wants, and you'd be surprised what gets in this category, actually. Maybe extra clothes beyond what you need, going out to eat, your cell phone bill, actually, your cable. So these are things you actually don't need to live, surprisingly, even though it feels like it sometimes. 20% on savings. So that would be retirement, paying off debt, and things like your crash fund or rainy day fund.
So in a nutshell, that's the 50-30-20. It's 50% for essentials, 30% for wants, and 20% for your savings.
And this, we should mention, is meant to be put into effect after tax. So your net income. So once you get your paycheck from work, that's what you should be using. So we wanted to run through these numbers and see how it played out from our budget. So our budget at this point is our income is around $9,000 a month. A little under, a little over, depending. But that's about right.
So how our budget breaks down is that $4,500 should be going to our essentials, $2,700 should be going towards wants, and $1,800 should be going towards savings. Now, when we look at our numbers and actually run what we have through our budget, we come out with some very different results.
For the essentials, we actually added everything up, and it's about $3,500. So we're about $1,000 below what that 50-30-20 rule would tell us to be at, and we're at about 39% of our income.
Yeah, and that also includes our childcare because that's an essential thing for us. That's not a want. That is an absolute need. We both have full-time jobs, and daycare is a necessity for us.
We have about $1,200 going towards wants right now. Now, I will say that is a little bit lower of a number than what actually plays out in reality. As we've mentioned in previous podcasts, we have this pesky little miscellaneous category that tends to get blown up each month. It's on things like, we have a car repair that comes up, or we just got a fish tank, actually, and it's amazing how expensive it is.
They're the worst. They're the absolute worst.
So some of that money where it's like, it's way too much to fit into our normal budget, we'll throw it on miscellaneous, and it's not the best practice. We'll say that right now. But the $1,200 is our baseline, and that's 13% of the income, I would say it's probably closer to 15 to 20% in reality.
Yeah, so we're pretty much on line with that recommendation. We're a little under. I think it's supposed to be 30%, but we're sitting around 10 to 20% depending on what's going on that particular month. Usually on the higher end of that.
For savings, we have so savings are where we're probably doing the best, I would say. We end up having about $4,300 going towards what they would consider savings within this 50-30-20 rule. So we put about $1,000 a month into our Roth IRAs so that we can max them out each year. We put $250 towards our son's college fund. And then whatever is left over after that, we actually just throw into paying off the house. So that is the way we deal with savings. Of course, we have our retirement, we have our college fund, but then we really want to get to paying down that debt of the house.
Right. That actually totals out to be about 47% of our income goes towards savings as far as retirement and paying off the house. So it's by far the largest chunk of money goes towards those things. But that's for a very good reason. Our goal is to pay off our house to retire early, and our largest debt by leaps and bounds, I think, that we've ever had, or most likely will ever have, is our house. So we want to pay it off as quickly as possible, because once we do that, that essentials budget becomes even smaller, and we can put even more money into savings, and we'll be able to really maximize our retirement at that point.
And again, just want to note, as our wants go up, when we have those miscellaneous expenses, our savings goes down. That's what takes a hit when we have those miscellaneous expenses. It's how much we can put towards our house that month.
Right. We kind of figured that putting extra on a house is a luxury to begin with. And if we have to put a little less on it, it's not the end of the world. We always want to keep it, particularly Danielle wants to keep it as high as possible. But if it's coming out of somewhere, it's going out of the money that we throw extra on the house, because that's where it makes the most sense to take it out of.
Speaking of the house, we're going to move on to some numbers that you might see floating around when it comes to the percentage of your income that should be spent on housing. So this could be mortgage, this could be renting, whatever it may be. One of the things you'll hear out there probably most often is 30% of your gross income, so before tax income. And I did a little just research, just some quick Googling. I had no idea where this actually came from, what the history of this 30% was. It actually came from something called the Brooke Amendment, where back in the 60s, they capped rent for public housing at 25%. And then Reagan later bumped that up to 30%. And that's where the number kind of stuck at for what your percentage of your income should be for housing. So many articles that I found as I was reading through said that 30% number is pretty outdated. So we were talking about back in the 60s. It doesn't take into account necessarily things like student loan debt, which has grown exponentially in recent years, and some of the retirement expectations that are coming up. You know, it's especially people in younger generations are really interested in taking that 15% seriously and putting a lot towards their retirement. So there's a lot of things that it just doesn't take into account because it is outdated. It's also not very flexible to just use this one number of 30%. Things vary so much in situations, in where you're living. So there's cost of living that varies dramatically, other debt you may have, the fact that you probably don't need to increase your house costs to maintain that 30% number as your income increases. For instance, we're nowhere near that 30%, and we don't feel like we need to be. Just because our income is increasing doesn't mean we have to automatically get a higher housing payment. So it might lead people to spend more than they need to.
One of the big financial guys out there is Dave Ramsey, and he says to do 25% of your take-home pay as far as the number goes, and to always make sure that number is based on a 15-year fixed-rate mortgage, because you get the lowest interest rates and you'll have your house paid off in 15 years, which is phenomenal. We didn't follow this advice at all. We have a 30% or 30-year mortgage, should I say, but we definitely took into account the 25% rule as far as that. 30%, 25%, and somewhere around there, you're doing pretty good as far as your housing goes. The lower end of that, the better.
So to compare our numbers for our budget, we spend about 18% of our net income on housing, on our mortgage, and about 12 to 13% of our gross income on our mortgage. So we're well under the numbers, and we're comfortable with that. And part of that is that we've refinanced to get a lower interest rate. We also pay down our house, as we just talked about. So we've figured out ways to make this lower, and we're okay with that.
And one final thing, when you're looking at buying a house, or if you're in a situation where you want to do that, take a look at your emergency fund. 3 to 6 months worth of expenses, which is pretty much a standard across the board. Make sure you have that set up. What do you need to have in there to be able to afford your house for 3 to 6 months, plus all of your other living expenses? It's a good ballpark to see how comfortable you are with that much money sitting somewhere. For us, that works out to be about $15,000. And we're fine with that. That makes me feel good that we have that money sitting there. But depending on your situation, if you're in a really expensive house or a really expensive area and you have, let's say, $100,000 sitting in the bank doing nothing other than just being an emergency fund, you may not be super comfortable with that, because you may want to be doing other things with that money.
Moving on to another area that you'll probably see a lot of rules and numbers for is your car payment. And this is pretty controversial. Some people are really into cars, and for some people, it's just something to get them from place to place. That's more of me.
Yeah, absolutely. I like cars. I would love to have a Tesla, but we don't need that. A car, by far and large, is a form of transportation to get me to work and back and to get me to places I want to go. And as long as it does it safely and reliably, I don't care.
I'm kind of on the same page with that. So one of the rules that I found when Googling, looking around, was something I actually haven't heard of before. It's the 24-10 rule. So it suggests that you put 20% of a down payment on your car. So 20% of the whatever you're going to be paying for your car. They suggest you to have a 4-year loan, or nothing greater than a 4-year loan, and that the car payment is no more than 10% of your gross income. That 10% also includes insurance as well. So that's your car payment, the premium that you're paying on it, the interest, and the insurance as well. The other rule that has been floating around out there is 20% of your gross income on all car-related expenses. So this will be all of the car payments you have, your car insurance, any maintenance on your car, anything else?
Fuel,
yes, gas, of course. So that's actually a lot. So, and it takes a little bit of work to kind of add all of those expenses up. But this rule suggests that that those expenses, when added up, don't equal any more than 20% of your gross income. We did a quick calculation for us, and thankfully we have one car fully paid off and one that we are still paying on, but is 0% interest. So for us, it was actually only 6% of our gross income for all of our car-related expenses.
Yeah, so we didn't fit with that rule. And also the first rule with the car of the 20-40-10 rule, we did not fit with that in any part of us owning a car. Our car, we didn't put anything down. It's on a 6-year loan, and then 10% of our gross income. I think we're right around there, I believe. But we always kind of just make sure the numbers work out, and we usually try to shoot for a monthly payment as long as it falls in a certain range and that the interest rate isn't too high. So as long as we're in that, we're happy, but that's not a tried and true version of doing it. You want to make sure that whatever the numbers are, you're not getting taken advantage of or not paying too much money, because shooting for a monthly payment usually means that you're going to either increase the years of a whole lot or you're going to get really high interest rates. So check those things. In our case, our first car that we ever bought, we had a 1.5% interest rate, and we paid that car off in a year and a half. And then our current car, our new car, was 0%. So it didn't matter as far as any of the other stuff.
The final rule that I found, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but the final rule that I found for cars was that the price of your cars should be no more than 50% of your gross income. I find this absolutely crazy, personally. Our gross income before anything is taken out is $160,000 combined. So half of that is $80,000. So this rule is saying it would be comfortable for us to spend $80,000 on our cars.
That Tesla sounded nice.
So I personally think that's way too much and way more than what we need, unless it's an area where you're really into it. And then it kind of gets into your want category a little bit, and you have to think through what's a need and what portion of that payment is more of a want. So that is something to consider, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing to be into cars. If it is, you just have to think about that as kind of more of a want, though.
No, and this one also really depends on income. If you're making $40,000 a year, a $20,000 car is crazy expensive, but I can understand a little bit of where that's coming from because that's generally about the cost of a lower model new car. But again, it's very dependent on where you're at with things. For us, that $80,000, that's just never going to happen. We're never going to spend that kind of money on cars, hopefully ever. But when we go in and take a look, when the cars were brand new, if we take their value as brand new, we were at $41,000 between the two cars. Now they're depreciated to $20,000, and both of our cars are under 5 years old. So cars are a terrible investment if you're looking at that. They've decreased by more than 50% in under 5 years. It's terrifying, but that's kind of just the general rule. We're at a quarter of our gross when they were brand new, and we're even less than that now.
The last thing we're going to talk about is retirement. This is one of the big ones. You hear a lot of numbers when it comes to retirement. So we're going to talk about specifically one rule that's out there called the 4% rule. And Nate's going to take a second to explain it a little bit.
Okay. The 4% rule, it sounds very simple, and it is. It just takes a quick second to calculate what's going on. So essentially what you want to do is you want to calculate how much money you spend that you need to live each year. That includes all of your fund money, anything that you need to live for a year. Calculate how much that is. And for this example, I'm going to use $40,000 because I want to go through easy math. What you're going to do is then you're going to take that amount of money, the $40,000, and you're going to multiply it by 25 years because that's the average length of a retirement. So we're going to take that 40, multiply it by 25. We're going to get to $1 million. And your goal before you retire is to have $1 million. Once you have that $1 million, you can retire and you'll be ready to go. The thing is the 4% rule comes into name because you're only allowed to take out 4% of that money each year. How they get this number is you have 7% as stock market growth, where your retirement money will be invested in, and interest grows at 3% of a year.
Inflation.
Inflation, not interest. I'm sorry. And then when you take 7 minus 3, you get 4%. There is a study called the Trinity study that found 100% of people who did this had enough money to live on for 25 years. 96% of people had enough money to live on for 30 years. So it's a really good tried and true method. And with anything with retirement, it's not 100% all the time. This is just one study, but the numbers do work out if you go through and run them. The reason why we also don't want to save less or take out, like, let's say 2%, or you don't want to go more like 8%, is because if you have 2%, you're going to wind up with too much money. And my goal is to die with no money because then I use it all. And then if you, on the other end, take out too much, you won't make the 25 years that a person lives on average. So you want to kind of play with those and see that. But the 4% rule is a really cool way to look at it, and something I never really thought of too much before. I was just told you save 10 to 15% of your income, put it into retirement, and you'll be good to go. And this kind of gives some backup to that general idea.
And, there are multiple ways to go about retirement. We talk about that in previous podcasts, and we'll probably expand on it more in future ones as well. 15% of your income isn't a bad rule to go by. We try and hit that. We're about there. We also like to diversify with our pension, our 401k, also using the Roth. So we have some after-tax retirement funds. So, there's lots of ways to go about retirement, but this 4% rule was pretty interesting and a cool calculation. So we thought we would share it with you guys. In a final note, we've gone through a lot of numbers during this episode here, and they're just starting points. They're just kind of estimations. And they don't take into account a lot of nuances, like other debt you may have and where you live and just your situation in general. So it's just important to not take these as an absolute. And I would say that before you do any of these calculations, any of these numbers, I would create a budget. I would go through and create a monthly budget. Start from where you're at. We've mentioned this before. Go through your last month's credit card bill or debit bill or whatever, and just figure out where you're spending your money, put it in various categories, and try to make a zero balance of your budget. So do that first and figure out how much you're comfortable spending on things like housing and a car. And then from there, test it against some of these numbers. See if it's lining up. See if you're way off base. If you are, maybe go back and look at your budget and revise some things. But use these more as a guide rather than, okay, these are the numbers I have to plug into my budget. Because you might be either spending too much in some cases, or you might be shortchanging yourself. You might be able to do away with some of those wants, or even, maybe you're not using that amount for needs and it's okay, and you can put more towards savings. So just personalize it to yourself.
And I think that's all we have. If you have any questions or you want to leave feedback for us, you can always visit us at budgetcouple.com. And show notes for this particular episode can be found at budgetcouple.com/episode 24.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Budget Couple Podcast with your hosts, Nate and Danielle. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit budgetcouple.com. Make sure to check out the next episode of the Budget Couple Podcast, where we'll talk more about life, family, and how to afford it. We'll catch you next time.